The champagne stopped pouring. The second, Robert Whitfield pointed at his son's bride. "Get out."
Get out of my house! This wedding is over! Leave now!
Poor trash doesn't stand on my marble. 200 guests turned to watch. None of them saw the black SUV already turning through the gate. Isn't just a story about a wedding that went wrong. It's about what happens when the man's hings. The man who thinks he owns the room doesn't know who built the ground underneath it. Before we get into this one, if you were standing in that ballroom, would you have said something? Drop it below. Now let's go back 2 hours before any of this happened. 2 hours earlier, Naomi Carter was standing in front of a mirror in a borrowed room at the Caro Estate, a private oceanfront Venzo Spainzu on South Oceanville Boulevard. And she was doing the thing she always did when she was nervous. She was counting. 7 pearl buttons down the back of the dress, 3 deep breaths between each one. A habit from childhood. From a house in Fort Pierce, where counting things was the only thing that ever stayed the same. She touched the thin gold necklace at her collarbone, a tiny anchor charm worn smooth at the edges. Her mother's, the only thing of her mother's she'd kept, because her mother had believed you didn't need much to be rich. You needed one thing you loved enough to never sell. Naomi was 29. She taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school 40 minutes, inland in a building where the air conditioning worked maybe half the time and the copier jammed on Fridays, like it had a personal grudge. She made $46,000 a year. She drove a 2014 Honda Civic with 161,000 miles on it, and a crack in the windshield shaped like a lightning bolt that she'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. None of the 200 people currently drinking champagne on the lawn outside knew any of that. Yes. For 2 years, since the night Ethan Whitfield had introduced her to his family, at a Christmas dinner that felt more like a shareholder meeting, Naomi had let them believe whatever they wanted to believe. She never lied. She just never corrected them. When Robert Whitfield's assistant asked where she'd summered as a child, Naomi said mostly near the water, which was true if you counted a 2-bedroom rental 4 blocks from a boat ramp. She hadn't hidden her life because she was ashamed of it. She'd hidden it because the one time she'd told the truth early on at a dinner where she mentioned her father worked in shipping. Robert Whitfield had laughed so hard he'd had to set down his fork. "Shipping," he'd said, like it was a punchline. "Well, someone has to load the boxes." Ethan hadn't laughed. Ethan had gone quiet, the particular quiet he went into whenever his father did something he couldn't fix. And later that night, he'd told Naomi, "You don't have to explain anything to him." Not ever. She'd believed him. Mostly. Ethan Whitfield was 31, lean, sharp-jawed, the kind of handsome that photographed better than it talked. He worked, nominally, as VP of Development at Whitfield Maritime Holdings, his father's company. Though anyone who'd spent time in the office knew Robert made every real decision, and Ethan signed what he was handed. It wasn't weakness. Exactly. It was survival. Ethan had spent 31 years learning that with his other smartetsring with his father cost more than it was worth, and somewhere in there he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. What he had never stopped noticing was Naomi. She was the first person who'd ever asked him what he wanted, instead of what he was going to do next. On their 3rd date, she'd asked him to name one thing. Just one. He'd choose for himself if his last name disappeared tomorrow. He hadn't been able to answer. He'd gone home and thought about it for 3 days. That was 2 years ago. Today, he was marrying her. Savi 300 feet away, checking his Rolex for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Irritated that the ceremony was running 4 minutes behind schedule. Robert Whitfield was 64 years old and worth, depending on which quarter you asked, somewhere north of $1 billion. He'd built Whitfield Maritime from a single tugboat tugboat contract. His own father left him in 1987 into one of the largest privately held shipping and logistics operations on the eastern seaboard. He wore a Navy tuxedo that had been altered twice because he refused to admit he'd gained weight. His silver hair was combed back with a precision that suggested a man who considered his own reflection a business asset. He had not wanted this wedding. Not because of wanted this wedding. He'd have said of Naomi specifically. Have said that, if pressed, and he would have been lying. He hadn't wanted it because a school teacher with a Honda Civic and no visible fanfare beyond. A father who couldn't make it to the rehearsal dinner swore did not fit into the architecture of a life. Robert had spent 4 decades constructing. Whitfields married into shipbuilding families, banking families, families with names on hospital wings. Whitfields did not marry the 3rd grade. He'd said as much to his wife, Diane, 3 weeks earlier. She's marrying our name, he'd told her. Not our son. Diane hadn't argued. Diane rarely argued with Robert about anything that mattered, which was, in its own way, the saddest fact in this entire story. Though nobody would say so out loud for a long time yet. The fluorescent light in the bridal suite flickered once, then held. Naomi's hands were steady as she pinned the veil. Outside, a string quartet was tuning, and somewhere past the hedges, 200 guests were finding their seats on white folding chairs, facing the Atlantic. She looked at her reflection one more time. "You've survived worse rooms than this one," she said quietly, to no one. It was something her mother used to say, and Naomi had never fully understood it until this exact moment. Standing in a $15,000 dress, about to walk into a family that had never once asked her a real question about who she actually was. She didn't know yet that in 2 hours that would change. Every single one of them was about to find out. The ceremony itself went the way ceremonies usually go when nobody involved actually wants to make a scene yet. Vows were exchanged. A string quartet played something from a movie nobody could name. Robert Whitfield sat in the front row with his jaw set in the expression he used for board meetings that weren't going his way, and he clapped when everyone else clapped. And that was that. The reception was where things started to come apart, and it started small, and it started the way these things always do. It started with a comment about shoes. Diane Whitfield, standing near the champagne tower in a Chanel gown that cost more than Naomi's annual salary, leaned toward a cousin and said, not quietly enough, "I do wonder where she got that necklace. It looks almost vintage." Vintage was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and everyone within earshot understood the translation. Cheap, Naomi heard it. She didn't react. She'd had 2 years of practice not reacting, and she touched the anchor charms once briefly, the way you'd touch a bruise, to check if it still hurt. And then she kept moving through the reception, greeting guests she'd never met, holding Ethan's hand a little tighter than before. By hour 2, Robert had had 3 scotches, which was 2 more than his doctor recommended, and exactly the number required to remove whatever filter had been holding his opinions in place for the last 2 years. The moment came at 7:40 p.m. During the toasts, Robert stood, tapped his glass, and gave a speech that started warm. A joke about Ethan as a boy, a line about welcoming a new member of the family, and then, somewhere around the 90-second mark, took a turn nobody saw coming, except the people who'd known Robert long enough to recognize the pattern. He'd had a plan for this speech. Somewhere in the Scotch, the plan dissolved, and what replaced it was worse. Naomi's family, unfortunately, couldn't make it tonight, he said, and there was something in the way he said "unfortunately" that made it sound like an accusation instead of a fact, which is a shame. I would have loved to meet the man who raised a woman who married into all this. He gestured, expansive. At the ballroom, the chandeliers, the ocean beyond the glass doors. But I suppose some families just don't travel in these circles. A few guests laughed, the nervous kind of laugh people do when they're not sure if something is a joke. Ethan's hand found Naomi's under the table. He squeezed once. Don't. Not here. Not yet. She didn't need the warning. She'd already decided, months ago, that whatever happened tonight, she would not be the one who made a scene. That had never been the plan. The plan had simply been to survive the evening Nat heard. Evening with her dignity intact, collect her husband, and go home to the life they'd actually built together. A life that had nothing to do with any of this marble. Bartwan finished. But Robert wasn't finished. 15 minutes later, as the band was setting up and guests were drifting toward the dance floor, Diane Whitfield discovered that her sapphire tennis bracelet, the one she'd taken off to wash her hands in the powder room, was missing from where she'd left it on the marble sink. She did not handle this quietly. It was right there, Diane said, loud enough that 3 separate conversations stopped. I said it right there, and now it's gone. The head of venue security, a broad-shouldered man named Delgado who'd worked events at the Caro estate for 11 years and had never once had to deal with an actual theft, was summoned within 90 seconds. Diane described the bracelet. 12 carats, appraised at $340,000. And then, before Delgado could even begin a proper search of the powder room, Robert Whitfield asked the question that changed the entire shape of the evening. Who was in there before Diane came out? Nobody answered immediately, because nobody had been keeping track, because it was a wedding, and people go to the bathroom, and nobody thinks to log it. Then a distant cousin, a woman named Patricia, who had had exactly enough wine to feel important, said, I saw the bride go in, right before Diane. It wasn't an accusation. Patricia would say later that she hadn't meant it as one. She was simply answering a question, stating a fact, the way you'd mention the weather. But Robert Whitfield's face did something in that moment that Naomi would remember for the rest of her life. It didn't shift into confusion, or curiosity, or even suspicion exactly. It shifted into relief. As if some part of him had been waiting 2 years for a reason. And here, finally, was one, handed to him by a distant cousin with too much Chardonnay in her system. Search her bag, Robert said. The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when it senses something is about to happen, that it will talk about for years afterward. Robert. Ethan's voice, low, warning. It's a simple thing, Robert said, already walking toward Naomi, already gesturing at Delgado to follow. If she has nothing to hide, it takes 10 seconds. Naomi stood very still. 200 people were watching. The band had stopped playing without anyone telling them to. Somewhere behind her, she heard her mother's voice in her memory. You've survived worse rooms than this one. And she made a decision she would later describe when she finally told this story to her own children as the hardest thing she'd ever done. She said nothing, and she handed Delgado her clutch. He opened it. Lipstick. A folded napkin with a phone number on it. From a guest who worked in education policy and wanted to talk about grants. A single house key. No bracelet. Check her again, Robert said, and something in his voice had gone thin and strange. The voice of a man who had already decided on an outcome and was now discovering the facts refused to cooperate. Sir, there's nothing. I said, check her again. It was at this exact moment, with Robert Whitfield standing 3 feet from his son's bride. One finger extended toward her chest. His face flushed the deep red that happens right before blood pressure becomes a medical event. That, he said the sentence, 200 people would repeat to each other for the rest of the night, and some of them, for the rest of their lives. But, get out. Poor trash doesn't stand on my marble. The room didn't gasp. It did something quieter and worse. It went completely, totally silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that you can feel pressing on your eardrums. Naomi didn't cry. She would think about that later, too. How her body had simply refused. How instead of tears, there was just a strange, cold clarity. Like stepping into water so cold. It stops registering as cold at all. Ethan moved first. He stepped between his father and his wife, one arm thrown across her, his jaw so tight. It looked like it might crack. "Take it back," he said. "Ethan, take it back right now, or I swear to God." And then, from the direction of the tall glass doors that led out to the driveway, a voice. Calm, unhurried. The kind of voice that didn't need volume, because it had never in 58 years needed to compete for a room's attention. "Is there a problem here?" Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, dressed in a plain charcoal overcoat with no tie. The kind of coat that photographed as expensive, only if you knew exactly what you were looking at, which almost nobody in that room did. He had a weathered face, a strong jaw, and a stillness to him that made Delgado, the head of security, take an involuntary step backward without understanding why. Robert Whitfield turned, already annoyed at the interruption, already composing the sentence he'd use. To have this stranger removed from the property. "This is a private event," Robert said. "I don't know who let you in, but—" "Marcus Doyle," the man said. He didn't extend a hand. He simply said the name the way you'd state a fact that didn't require confirmation. "I believe you were about to search my daughter." The silence that followed was different from the first one. The first silence had been shock. This one was the sound of 200 people, simultaneously trying to do math. "They didn't have the information for yet. Robert started and stopped. "Naomi," Marcus said, and for the first time since walking through the door, his voice changed. Not much, just enough for the people closest to him to notice something underneath the calm. He looked at his daughter, at the tears, finally, starting, now, at the wedding dress, at the necklace, at her throat that he recognized, because he'd watched her mother wear it for 19 years before she died. "I'm sorry I'm late. Traffic on I-95. Dad." Naomi's voice cracked on the single syllable. Robert Whitfield looked between the two of them, and something in his stomach had started to drop, though he wouldn't have been able to say why yet, not with facts, only with facts, host's voice, with the particular instinct of a man who has spent 40 years in negotiations and has learned to smell the moment before he loses one. "I don't know who you are," Robert said, "but this is a family matter, and I'd ask you to." "Doyle Maritime Logistics," Marcus said. "Charleston, Savannah, and the port of Palm Beach. We signed a 14-month freight contract with Whitfield Maritime Holdings in March. Container throughput, mostly. Your CO, Danvers, I believe, handled the paperwork on your end." Robert's face did not move for exactly 2 seconds, which, for a man who prided himself on never letting his face move at all, was an eternity. Whitfield Maritime's single largest logistics contract, the one that had kept 3 of their Gulf Coast terminals operational through a brutal fourth quarter, the one Robert had bragged about at the last shareholder meeting as proof the company was diversifying smartly, ran through a subcontractor Robert had never personally met. He'd left it to Danvers. He always left the operational contracts to Danvers. "You're Doyle," Robert said slowly, and it wasn't a question anymore. "I'm Doyle," Marcus said. "And you just called my daughter poor trash in front of 200 people, in a room with a marble floor that, incidentally, was shipped through one of my terminals 11 months ago. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone had come out. Then, another. Nobody would remember later exactly whose phone it was that started recording first. It hardly mattered by morning, because by morning there would be 4 different angles of this exact moment circulating on group chats, up and down Palm Beach, each one zooming in on Robert Whitfield's face at the precise second. His 40 years of certainty cracked down the middle. "Marcus," Robert said, and his voice had changed entirely now, gone soft and fast in the way voices go when a man realizes he's standing on ground that isn't actually his. "There's clearly been a misunderstanding. My wife's bracelet went missing, and—" "I heard," Marcus said. "I was in the driveway. Windows were open." He hadn't raised his voice once. That, Naomi would think later, was the part that stayed with her the longest. Not what he said, but how quietly he said it. Her father had never needed volume to be terrifying. He'd learned that running docks full of men twice his size, decades ago, in a business where the wrong kind of loud got people hurt. "I'll need everyone to know," Marcus continued, turning now to address the room, not just Robert, "that my daughter has spent the last 2 years teaching 3rd grade at a public school 40 minutes from here. She makes $46,000 a year. She drives a car with a cracked windshield. None of that has anything to do with whether or not she's allowed to stand on this floor tonight." He looked back at Robert. "But it has everything to do with whether Doyle Maritime renews its contract with your company in November." Diane Whitfield's bracelet was found 40 minutes later in the coat check, tangled in the lining of the jacket she'd worn earlier that evening, and later handed off without checking the pockets. She had not been robbed. She had simply misplaced 12 carats and $340,000 in the most predictable way possible, and in the panic of trying to locate it, she had watched her husband accuse an innocent woman of theft in front of 200 witnesses and several recording phones. Nobody clapped when the bracelet turned up. There was nothing to clap for. There was only the slow, uncomfortable understanding moving through the room like a change in weather, that everyone present had just watched something happen that could not be taken back. I think about Robert Whitfield in that moment, standing in his own ballroom with 200 phones aimed at his face. And I don't feel triumph for him losing. I feel something stranger. I think about a man who spent 40 years building a company on the idea that he could see value before anyone else could. That was his gift. Supposedly, the eye for a good contract, a good deal, a good hire. And in the one moment it actually mattered. Standing 3 feet from a woman his own son had chosen. He couldn't see any value in her at all. He wasn't testing her worth. He was protecting his own idea of what worth was supposed to look like. What most of the 200 guests didn't know, what even Ethan hadn't fully understood until Marcus said it out loud, was exactly how deep the Doyle contract ran into Whitfield Maritime's operations. It wasn't a side deal. It wasn't a minor vendor relationship that could be quietly replaced with a phone call to a competitor. Doyle Maritime Logistics handled container throughput for 3 of Whitfield's 5 East Coast terminals, and had Smuts quietly absorbed the overflow capacity from a 4th terminal after a labor dispute had shut down Whitfield's own crews for 11 days. Danvers, the COO, had negotiated the emergency contract himself. In a hurry, grateful to have found a logistics partner who could scale fast without asking for the premium other companies would have charged for the inconvenience. Robert had approved the contract from a distance, the way he approved most operational paperwork. A signature on page 11 of a document he'd skimmed for the total dollar figure and nothing else. He had never once asked who owned Doyle Maritime. He'd had no reason to. It was, in the language he used with his board, a mid-tier logistics partner, a phrase that told you everything about how little attention he'd paid, and nothing about the man standing in his ballroom now. Marcus Doyle had built that company from a single leased barge in 1994. The same year Naomi was born, in a stretch of the Florida coast where he'd grown up watching his own father get passed over for promotions at a shipping company that never once considered that a black dock worker might understand freight logistics better than the is above him. Seek them? Fegbesber. Marcus had spent the next 3 decades proving, quietly and repeatedly, that he did. He never talked about the money. He talked about the work, the routes, the terminals, the negotiations that took 11 months instead of 11 days, because that was how long it took to build trust with port authorities who'd been burned before by fly-by-night operators. By the time Naomi was in college, Doyle Maritime had grown into a company most of the industry respected and almost nobody outside the industry had ever heard of, which was exactly how Marcus preferred it. I never told her not to talk about it, Marcus would say later, when Naomi finally asked him why she'd never known the full scale of what her father had built. I told her I didn't want her to be loved for it. I wanted her to find out who actually saw her first. That, it turned out, was the real reason Naomi had let the Whitfields believe whatever they wanted for 2 years. It wasn't fear. It was a test she hadn't fully admitted to herself. She was running a quiet, patient experiment. See whether Ethan, and by extension his family, would ever love the version of her that didn't come with a number attached. Ethan had passed the test in year 1 without knowing he was taking it. Robert had just failed it in front of 200 witnesses in the worst possible way. The morning after the wedding, Robert Whitfield sat in his home office overlooking the intracoastal waterway and did not sleep. He had, by then, watched the video 11 times. 4 different angles. 200,000 views on one. Re-upload alone, by the time the sun came up, a number that would triple by noon and keep climbing through the following week because a billionaire calling his son's bride poor trash, and then discovering she was the daughter of a man who could shut down 4 of his terminals in a single phone call was, it turned out, exactly the kind of story the internet had been waiting for. Danvers called at 6:40 a.m. Robert, we have a problem. I know, Danvers said. I mean a real problem. I already spoke with Doyle's office this morning. They haven't said they're pulling the contract, but they haven't said they're not. Iserta. And our stock opened down 4% on the video alone. If the actual contract talk gets out, how bad? Terminal capacity for 3 sites. If Doyle pulls out before we can source a replacement, we're looking at a minimum 6-week gap in container processing on the Gulf side during peak season. Robert didn't say anything for a long moment. Get me a meeting, he finally said, with Marcus Doyle. Today, if possible. Robert. Danvers's voice had the particular caution of a man who has worked for someone for 11 years and has learned exactly when it's safe to push back. I don't think Doyle wants a meeting with you. I think he wants to see what you do next. There's a difference. There is a particular kind of arrogance that doesn't announce itself as arrogance. It wears the shape of confidence for so long that the man wearing it forgets there was ever a difference. Robert had spent 40 years being right about deals, right about deals, right about people, right about which risks were worth taking. And somewhere in those 40 years, being right had quietly turned into something else. The belief that he could tell a person's worth just by looking at what they were wearing when he met them. He wasn't a stupid man. Stupid men don't build billion-dollar companies. But intelligence and perception are not the same thing. And Robert had spent so long trusting his instincts that he'd stopped checking whether they were actually seeing anything real. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, subscribe for more stories like this one. So we're just getting to the part where the truth actually costs something. Now, let's continue. Robert did not get his meeting that day. Or the next. What he got 3 days later was a letter. Actual paper delivered by courier, not email, which Robert would later admit unsettled him more than a lawsuit would have. Informing Whitfield's dist Maritime Logistics that Doyle Maritime Logistics would be honoring the remainder of the existing contract term through its expiration in November, in keeping with the professional standards this company has always upheld, but would not be renewing. No lawsuit. No public statement. Just a door, closing quietly, in a way that gave Robert nothing to fight against. The board found out the following week, and boards, whatever else you can say about them, are exceptionally good at recognizing when a captain has become a liability rather than an asset. The stock had stabilized somewhat by then, but the video was still circulating, still finding new audiences, and 3 separate reporters had communications team to Whitfield's communication tools asking for comment on the wedding incident, the vote to remove Robert Whitfield as CEO, replacing him in an interim capacity with Danvers, of all people, the man who'd spent 11 years quietly cleaning up after him. Happened in a closed session 6 weeks later. Robert kept his seat on the board and his ownership stake. He did not keep the office on the top floor or the assistant who'd worked for him for 15 years in the way that mattered most to him. Or, in the way that mattered most to him, the certainty that had defined every room he'd ever walked into. Diane filed for divorce 4 months after that. It wasn't really about the wedding. Though the wedding was the moment she finally admitted to herself what she'd known for a long time. That she had spent 30 years married to a man who needed to feel superior to everyone in a room, including, eventually, her, Patricia, the distant cousin whose comment had started the whole cascade, found herself quietly uninvited from 3 subsequent family gatherings, a punishment nobody officially announced but everybody understood. Naomi never sued anyone, never gave an interview, despite 4 separate requests from producers who wanted to turn the wedding incident into a segment. She went back to her 3rd grade classroom the following Monday because report cards were due, and 22 8-year-olds didn't care what had happened to her over the weekend. And there was something in that, in the total, indifferent normalcy of grading spelling tests. The day after your father-in-law tried to have you searched for theft in front of 200 people, that Naomi found she needed more than she needed an apology. The apology came anyway, eventually, though not the way anyone expected. Robert Whitfield showed up at Naomi and Ethan's house, a modest 3-bedroom in a neighborhood 40 minutes from the coast. Nothing like the properties he was used to visiting. On a Tuesday evening in late October, 6 months after the wedding, he came alone, without an assistant, without a car service, driving himself in a sedan. Naomi didn't recognize. He stood on the porch for a long moment before he knocked. "I'm not here to ask for the contract back," he said, when Naomi opened the door. "I know that ship sailed. I mean that literally, I suppose, given the industry." Naomi didn't smile. She wasn't ready to, not yet. "I came because I've spent 6 months trying to figure out how to explain what happened that night, and I don't have a version of it that doesn't make me sound like exactly what the video makes me look like," Robert said. "So I stopped trying to explain it. I just wanted to say I was wrong. Not about the bracelet. About you. I decided who you were before I ever asked you a single real question. And that's..." He stopped. Started again. "That's the same thing I did to my own son for 31 years. I just never had 200 phones pointed at me before to notice." He held out something small, wrapped in plain brown paper, no ribbon. Naomi opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph. Old, slightly creased. A black and white image of a dockyard from the 1960s. Men loading crates onto a ship, and in the corner, barely visible, a young black man who could only have been in his 20s, standing with a clipboard, watching. "That's your grandfather," Robert said. I had someone dig through old Port Authority archives after everything. He worked the same terminal my father used to run freight through. Different companies. Same dock, different decades. I don't know what that means. Exactly. I just thought you should have it. Some things get passed down that nobody ever writes into a contract. Naomi held the photograph for a long time. "Thank you," she finally said. "That's not an apology. But it's something." "I know," Robert said. "I'm working on the apology. It's taking longer than I expected. I've seen something like this before. Not at a wedding. Not with anyone rich. My own grandmother spent 40 years cleaning houses in a neighborhood she could never have afforded to live in herself. And I remember, as a kid, watching a woman she worked for speak to her like she wasn't in the room, asking me, a 10-year-old, questions about my grandmother, as if my grandmother couldn't give an answer for herself. My grandmother never said anything about it. She just kept working, kept her dignity folded up small enough to carry, and went home every night to a house that was hers, paid for, free and clear. 12 years before that woman's own mortgage was. I think about her every time I write one of these stories. Not because the money ever mattered to her, but because nobody in that house ever thought to ask what she actually knew. A year after the wedding, Naomi and Ethan hosted a small dinner at their house. Nothing like the Caro estate, nothing like marble floors or champagne towers. Just a table, 8 chairs, and the people who actually mattered. Marcus Doyle sat at one end, still wearing his plain steel watch, still saying almost nothing unless it counted. Robert Whitfield sat near the middle, quieter than anyone who'd met him a year earlier would have believed possible. Passing dishes. Listening more than talking. Diane wasn't there. She'd built a smaller, calmer life for herself in a condo near her sister in Sarasota, and she and Naomi still spoke sometimes. Carefully, the way two people speak when they're both still figuring out what forgiveness is supposed to feel like. At one point, during dinner, Ethan reached over and refilled Naomi's water glass without being asked, the way he'd done every night for 2 years, long before any of them knew the other's father's name. Naomi touched the anchor necklace at her throat. "You've survived worse rooms than this one," she said quietly, to no one in particular, the way her mother used to say it. Nobody at the table asked what she meant. They didn't need to. The room went on being ordinary. Dishes passed, wine poured, a dog barking somewhere down the street. And that, in the end, was the whole point. Not the reversal. Not the contract. Or the boardroom vote. Or the video with 4 million views. By the time anyone stopped counting. Just a table where everyone finally saw everyone else clearly. A year. Too late for some of them, but not too late for all of it to matter. After everything that happened, people remembered more than just the mistake. They remembered this moment when someone finally saw another person for who she truly was. Sometimes, we judge too quickly. We make decisions based on appearances, assumptions, or the little pieces of a story we think we understand. But every person carries a history we may never see. A small act of kindness can open a door. And sometimes, the person we think needs saving is the one who changes us the most.